This story started from one very distant but beautiful place on the shores of a cold ocean. The girl, named Demi, stood staring off into the distance. It was still quite cold outside, causing her breath to steam. For a while, she just stood there watching the ocean live its life. But then suddenly, as it were, some unknown man came up behind her and startled her. Demi jumped with surprise. The man noticed her and said she was looking at the ocean again, but it wouldn't bring back her runaway husband. The girl didn't understand why he immediately started talking to her like that, so she decided to start by saying hello. Then, with her head down, she said that Tachyon hadn't actually run away. He'd just gone to the capital in order to. But the girl didn't have time to finish, because she was interrupted by a man holding a net of fish behind his back. He told Demi that if this guy left 5 years ago, that meant he was gone for good and they would never meet again. The girl, of course, in her heart of hearts understood all this. However, she didn't want to realize it. So she just lowered her head, holding back her tears so as not to show weakness. The man, looking at her, suddenly became thoughtful, then seized her hand and said that she only came to this place very often because the Dowager Lady Romerby was pestering her. In fact, he grabbed her hand and showed her with his eyes the bruises that were on her fingers because of the lady she was staying with. There were also wounds on her hand that had already healed and left their mark on her body. Demi kept her emotions to herself, for she was used to not being allowed to show weakness in any way, and that her very sorry to have to live in such a life. So the girl pulled her hand out and, turning away from the man, said not at all, and it was all her fault. Then she also added in a trembling voice that Lady Romerby always treated her well, and she could not say such bad things about a lady. Then the man looked at poor Demi in surprise and asked, "Does she really think Mistress is treating her well by beating her very badly?" The girl did not want to hear all this, for she herself knew the truth, that such a life should not be. She thanked him for his concern. She said that she was probably already looking for her now, so she should go back. The man felt a little uncomfortable with this conversation, because there wasn't really anything he could do about it. He just told her to be more careful next time, and also, looking at Demi's unhappy look, added that it could return to this place at absolutely any time. In fact, he was so worried because she had become like his own daughter, and he just couldn't bear to see the girl suffer. Quite some time had passed since then, and Demi finally returned home. The sun had already begun to set outside, and as soon as she arrived, she was immediately greeted by Mistress with very loud screams. Lady Romerby, as soon as she saw the girl, said she was still as bold as ever and asked, "Has she gone to the ocean again without her permission?" The woman was indignant, saying that Demi did not even try for her to love her, still as silent and avoiding her gaze. The girl did stand across from her with her head down, and then, with a trembling voice, called her mother and asked for forgiveness. When Lady heard her start calling her that, she laughed in surprise and asked how dare she even call her that, since she wasn't her mother. At that moment, the servants who were standing behind began to whisper. One of the maids said that Demi was certainly a fallen noblewoman, but she didn't understand how anyone could yell at her like that. But her partner objected and said she wasn't noble at all. But her partner objected and said that she was not noble at all, and that all she had were debts, and she should be grateful that she could be on the estate at all. Lady Romerby kept shouting and said that the girl couldn't function properly because she was unsociable and her son just had terrible taste. In fact, Demi was used to such insults by now, but she was still always offended when she talked about her son. But at that moment the lady suddenly turned to the servants and asked that they bring a rod for her, and at this point the girl couldn't keep quiet anymore. She started to beg the lady, showing her mangled arm and telling her not to do it, because her wounds hadn't even healed yet. But the woman only looked at her contemptuously and said that in that case she should have behaved much better, and she would not have been punished for her behavior. She also wondered how it was that Demi could have done something stupid, and now begged her not to punish the girl. Romerby asked, wondering if the girl thought that because of some few scratches she would miss her punishment. But next time, for that not to be the case, she must behave better, and then she would not be beaten. By then, the woman had already been brought a rod, and she would not listen to what Demi had to say, and began to hurt her with all her might, along her arms, creating more and more wounds. It was an incredible pain for the girl, so she began to choke in her tears, all the while begging for the lady to stop doing it. However, everything was absolutely useless. The woman was merciless. From that moment, there were several more minutes of loud and violent blows. Then Demi fell to the floor exhausted and all shaking with fear and incredible pain. Romerby, at this point, exhaled with relief and looked arrogantly at the girl and told her to now go and clean up the office. Demi had nothing else to do but obey. Her hands were covered in blood and new scratches, and she was shaking badly because of all the blows. But she stood up and told Mistress that everything would be done now. With slow but steady steps, the girl soon arrived at the right place, and opening the door with a trembling hand, stepped inside. As soon as Demi was in the office, she immediately saw a huge picture above the workplace, where this ruthless lady was sitting, and next to her stood a young and very even attractive man. These men were Tae-hyun, the guy that Demi waits by the ocean shore every day, and the one she thinks about every minute of her life. In fact, just some 5 years ago, Demi was incredibly happy, and could not even imagine that her life could change like this in an instant. One day, she was standing in the woods with her lover, and Tae-hyun was looking at his beautiful girl, talking about taking her as his wife. They were completely alone. The girl was wearing an incredibly beautiful white dress, and he was standing in a black business suit. Tae-hyun looked her straight in the eyes, and then told her that he promised to love and cherish her for better or for worse for the rest of their lives. Then he took out a small ring with a flower on it and put it on her ring finger. Demi was incredibly happy at that moment. She looked into his ruby eyes and realized that she was even ready to give her life for a few minutes next to him. She smiled and said she also vowed to love him for the rest of their lives and to always be there for him. Then Tae-hyun smiled back and thanked her, saying that even though it was a secret wedding where it would be just the two of them, one day they would definitely have a very lavish wedding in front of all the people in the world. The man then embraced his bride and said that when he became successful and recognized in the capital, his mother would surely approve of their marriage, and they would live happily ever after, just like in all fairy tales. It was a farewell little ceremony for just the two of them, and Dai to me thought of how she would surely wait for him until he returned from the capital. She would be faithful to him. No matter what happened, her heart would belong to Tae-hyun alone. But things didn't turn out the way she had imagined. In fact, Count Durdekin Romerby is the head of this very house, and also her husband. And very often the girl wondered how he was doing, all alone in such a vast capital. On days like this, she missed him more than ever. Demi walked over to the table at that moment and began going through the letters that lay there. The girl looked at the date and realized that she hadn't heard from him in quite some time, and he writes to me more even than to his mother. Demi wasn't going to think anything bad, but just assumed that he was very busy, causing him to not have time for such simple things. And at that moment, as she was going through the papers to put them in order on her desk, she was surprised to see what was drawn on one of them. In one of the letters, the girl saw a photo portrait of some incredibly beautiful and noble lady. She did not even begin to read the contents of this letter. Her hands began to gradually sink. Demi missed a few letters on the floor, which also had a number of different beautiful ladies of noble lineage painted on them. For a while she just stood there staring at it all. After that, when she looked at the last paper, she saw that it said something about astrological compatibility. Demi was really horrified by all the information she saw. She got a headache just like that, so she quickly gathered up all the papers that had fallen on the floor and put them back on the desk. The girl didn't even want to think about what Lady Romerby was trying to do. The mere thought of it frightened her. Then she shifted her gaze somewhere to the side and saw a small notebook lying nearby. She realized it was the lady's secret folder. Her hand trembled as Demi reached for those papers. She knew, of course, she shouldn't even touch them. However, the girl realized that she absolutely had to find out the whole truth, and as soon as she opened the notebook, it immediately opened at the most interesting and important place. There were pictures of her, and there was a paper enclosed about a request for murder, the target, of course, being the girl herself. As soon as Demi saw it, straight like that, she screamed in horror. She couldn't believe that Madame was really trying to kill her and find a new woman for the Tae-hyun that she thought would be a better fit. She found it hard to breathe, so the girl quickly ran out of the office, slamming the door behind her. She ran down the corridors, unable to hold back her emotions and tears. It was hard for her to do so because of the recent blows. But she did her best, not knowing what to do now. Demi realized that her life was under the greatest threat at the moment, but she was only interested in one thing: whether Taehyung knew about it. Well, then she quickly dismissed those thoughts from her mind. You see, he certainly wouldn't be able to help her mother with this, for he was now in the capital. In fact, Demi didn't want to die more than anything else, for her life had been so unsweet these past few years. Some time had passed since then, and the lady went to her office to do some paperwork duties. But as soon as she got there, she was very surprised. Mrs. Rummerby ran out of the office screaming, saying that she had specifically asked this idiot to clean the office and questioned where she had even gone, and why she had scattered all the papers. Demi, at this moment, however, grabbed the braid from her room and immediately ran out of the manor into the cold street, where it was just beginning to freeze hard and snowing. It was already getting dark outside, and at that moment the two men were just passing through the very forest where the girl had fled. Their teeth were shaking along with their bodies, for it was really cold outside. One of the men turned to the other and said that it had been snowing incredibly hard and freezing for the last few days. The man, wiping his snot, which could have frozen at the same second, said that he knew, and that was not why he had moved from the north to the south. It was a surprise to everyone that there could be such a high frost in such an area. His partner sighed heavily and said he hoped the railroad would not be closed because of the blizzard. Well, the man got angry and asked if he wanted to jinx them now. Let him not say all his fears, because they do not necessarily come true, and in the worst way. But at that moment they suddenly saw someone in the distance who was running fast. Then one of the men started shouting, saying that this was private property and the stranger had no right to be on its territory. She continued to run without listening to these men. Then another one shouted, saying she was not allowed to enter that area. And at that moment, Demi, who had already lost all her strength, fell on the cold snow and did not move. The men immediately came up to her. They were incredibly surprised, not understanding what a half-naked girl was doing outside in such a frost. Several other guards who were escorting a very important person had already approached them. They began to look at the stranger, not understanding who she was. At that moment, however, the gentleman they were accompanying came up behind them, and seeing the crowd of people, asked them what had happened there and why they had stopped. This man was Mr. Hestwatt, and the guards immediately dispersed to let him pass. He was a rather tall and pumped-up man, who also had ruby eyes like Taehyung. One of the guards said as the gentleman passed him that they weren't sure where the woman had suddenly appeared from and just fell in front of them. Mr. Hastworth came closer and closer, and when he saw the girl's face, he stopped at once. He recognized her. He knew Demi. The poor girl herself fainted. She was lying on the cold snow, crying, her hands even redder because of the frost. In fact, before all this happened, Demi was still standing in front of the manor for some time, questioning whether she should leave the place. She didn't know where she would go if she left this house, because she had absolutely nowhere to go. She didn't know anyone in town, and in general, no one knew or liked her. But soon Demi finally came to a town where there were only men around her. It was night, and they were returning from their work. Many were too tired to pay attention to her, but others, the more daring ones, even began to molest the poor girl. One of these insolent men was a blonde-haired man. He came up to her, put his arm around her shoulder, asked if she needed a place to stay because he had a spare room, and asked her how she felt about staying with him. Demi was wary. She knew he couldn't be trusted, so she said in as confident a voice as she could that she wasn't at all, just looking for a carriage. The man began to lower his hand lower and lower, saying that she looked quite rich, and also inquired if she was a noblewoman. Soon his arm was already around her waist, and he said that if she had run away from home he might as well take care of her, and also inquired how she looked upon spending the evening with him. Demi was annoyed enough, so she managed to shove him aside and slip out of the stranger's grasp. She also yelled for him to stop doing that. The girl was becoming more and more frightened by the minute, but her persistence only made the man angrier. He ran closer to her and grabbed her arm, pulling her straight to him. She started screaming loudly because of the fear and pain in her arm. But then suddenly a very familiar voice sounded to Demi. That voice asked the stranger to let her go. The man immediately looked in the direction from which the sound had come, and warily loosened his grip a little. Demi immediately turned toward her savior, and when she saw the familiar face of the same fisherman who meets her near the ocean all the time, she rejoiced. The man at this point approached the stranger and grabbed him by the shirt and asked him what he was even doing, how he could molest an innocent girl. The stranger realized that it was better not to mess with him, so swearing, he headed back somewhere behind the alley to look for another victim, and Demi at that moment fell to the ground, shaking with fear. Finally, the stranger turned to the girl and told her that if she already had a boyfriend, she should have just said so. He also called her a girl of easy behavior, and then disappeared in the dark. The fisherman at this point turned back to the girl and asked what it all meant, and if she was okay at all. Demi was shaking all over. She said in a shaky voice that not at all. She thought she was going to be kidnapped and do every bad thing she could think of. The man still didn't understand what was going on, and asked why she was in this place so late. She should be at home. Demi couldn't hold back her tears and, crying, said she'd just run away from it. Then he sat down close to her and put his arm around her and asked what it meant. The girl only replied that she had nowhere else to go, where she had lived before. She was no longer welcome. She doesn't even want to go back there in her life. The fisherman got to his feet at that moment, and told her to go to him in that case. He smiled wickedly, as if he were glad that things had turned out this way. When Demi heard that and looked at him and asked if he was serious about saying that, "But he's not supposed to do that, is he?" But he then replied that there were no carriages at this late hour, and it was too dangerous for a woman to stay in an inn all alone. One never knows what horny men might think of, and he also said he was still sad about the fact that she couldn't trust him. Demi immediately said that wasn't true at all, and she didn't mean it. The fisherman at this moment extended his hand to her and smiled and asked, in that case, what was she waiting for? They should go into a warm place soon so she wouldn't get sick. And Demi could not believe her luck. For a while she was still in doubt whether she should do it. But soon she put her hand on his and thanked him for his kindness. After some more time they came to the man's house, where he had set aside a specially separate room for her. There was no lock on the door, so the girl simply slammed it shut as soon as she entered and exhaled with relief, glad that she finally had a place to sleep. She lit a candle so that it wouldn't be so dark, and so onto the bed thinking about various things. For the moment, Demi was all alone in a very quiet place. At last, the girl could feel relief and peace. Knowing that no one would touch her, she realized that she needed to sleep, at least a little. And as soon as the sun rose, she would go straight to the capital by carriage. The candle continued to burn out, and the girl thought about the fact that he would be drinking outside while she was in this place. So she would definitely have to leave as soon as possible so that he could return to his home at last. Well, Demi was still only interested in one question. What should she do next? And how to live? What direction to take? The thoughts plagued her for a while longer, but after that she turned on her side and began to fall asleep. Of course, the girl had run off all alone, with no plan and not knowing if she would be able to see Taehan again, even if only for a moment. Soon the candle finally burned out, and the girl fell asleep. But then suddenly the door creaked open, and a man began to enter the room. Because Demi felt safe and very tired, she didn't hear it all, and the man came closer and closer to the sleeping girl. Suddenly she felt someone staring at her, so she opened her eyes and turned around to see the fisherman who had let her live above her. The girl was very surprised. She was about to scream for help, but he reacted faster and put his hand over her mouth. His eyes were like a madman's. He was sweating and even blushing. The man turned to Demi and said that it was him and she needn't worry. Well, tears came to the girl's eyes. She didn't understand why him. The man kept pressing his hand on her face to stop her from screaming. At this point he suddenly smiled and said that he knew this day would come someday, and the man was very glad it had happened so quickly. He continued to stare at the girl and said that they loved each other, and when he talked to her, she smiled back at him. When he gave her food, she ate it all. Demi lay on the bed, from grabbing his hand, trying to pull away. She realized that something very bad was about to happen, and the man said that she had come to the embankment to see him, because she couldn't live without him. He also said that there was no way she would have done that. If she didn't have feelings for him, he drenched himself in sweat, smiled, and said he loved her very much. Demi realized that there was no way she could let all this happen, and closing her eyes, began to cry. She mustered the strength to deliver her blow, and just as the man was about to pull down his pants, she hit him right in the elbow and kicked him in a very delicate place with her foot. trying to get out of his horrible hands. And at this moment, the girl suddenly opened her eyes with tears in them. She was very frightened, so her breathing was incredibly fast. But as soon as she opened her eyes, she saw some blonde-haired man in front of her, looking surprised and worriedly straight into her eyes. The girl looked around and realized that she was at the wrong fisherman's house, and that calmed her down a little. But her breathing was still very heavy, and tears kept flowing from her eyes. The man was silent for a while, then leaned closer to her and called her name. Demi at that moment realized that something was wrong here, so she immediately began to look around, not understanding where she was, because she was lying on a rather expensive and soft bed, and there were many servants around. After looking around at everyone, she had no way of knowing who all these people were, for she had never seen servants like this before. But then the girl shifted her gaze to the man who continued to stand beside her and stare sternly. Demi at that moment immediately recognized him and looked surprised and thought, "Is it really Evan?" However, the man was very serious and turned to the girl and asked if it was appropriate for a married woman to barge into a single man's home. Demi immediately sat up on the bed and started covering herself with the blanket. She started screaming, saying that she hadn't barged in at all, but Evan still looked very upset and said it didn't matter at all, and wondered what had brought her to this place. He then examined her from head to toe, and added what on earth she was doing in his duchy looking like that. In fact, Demi's appearance really wasn't the most decent. Her whole dress was torn and dirty, and in some places even bloody. Her hands were cut because of the landlady who kept beating her, and they were also covered in blood. She was very ashamed of it. At that moment, the girl began to remember everything that had happened that night in that horrible house. After punching the fisherman in the arm and stomach, she was able to break free from his grasp and run away. But in the final seconds, the man realized she was going to leave him, so he grabbed her foot and started pulling her toward him. Demi fell to the floor because she hadn't expected this. He began to bring her foot to his mouth to run his tongue over it. The girl couldn't do anything about it. She just lay on the floor and screamed and cried loudly. She tried to pull her leg out, but his grip was strong enough. But at that moment, she saw a small hook that had apparently come off his fishing rod. The girl immediately reached for it, knowing that it would be her salvation. And when she did get it out, she immediately turned back to the man, who was crawling closer and closer to her and shoving his hands up her skirt. Demi put the hook right in his eye. He immediately grabbed his eye and started screaming loudly in pain. Demi grabbed her jacket and ran for her life. Remembering all the events of the previous night, she sat there trembling with fear, realizing that if she hadn't shown her power then, there was no telling how it would have ended. Evan became wary at this point. He didn't understand why the girl wasn't answering anything, and in a loud but true voice he asked, "Didn't she hear what he said to her?" For a while, the girl was still silent, but then she looked at him and said that first of all, she apologized for coming unannounced to him, but then Demi added that she also had something she had to give back to him. Evan was immediately wary and asked, "And what is it that she has to give back to him?" The girl at this point began to reach into the pocket of her dress and said that she didn't know she had had it all these years, but she saw fit to return it at once as soon as she found it. At that moment she pulled out a napkin containing a small but incredibly beautiful piece of jewelry and held it out to the man. She asked if it was his. The man took this piece of jewelry and began to examine it with a very sad, serious face. At this point she continued talking, saying that she thought she should return it before she left the place. After that she started to get out of her bed, saying that was it and she should be on her way. But at that moment Evan suddenly said in a very cold voice that he didn't need it at all. The girl heard this and became alarmed. She looked at him in surprise and asked him what he was saying. But Evan at this point let go of that piece of jewelry and said that there are actually a lot of things like that in this house. The jewelry didn't fall to the floor. It ended up on the sheets of the bed. Demi didn't know what to say to that, so she just sat silently for a while. She didn't understand how such a thing was possible. Then the girl with a trembling voice apologized to him, saying that she had been terribly rude then, so she was going right now and would never come back, so that he would forget her once and for all. But Evan was even angrier at this point. He clenched his jaw and said through gritted teeth that he wasn't actually done. Then the man moved closer to her and said that she still made him feel resentful, and he hated her with all his soul. Demi didn't even know what to say to that. She hadn't expected the man to hold a grudge against her all these years, but Evan said he wasn't actually embittered enough to kick her out in such terrible weather. Then the girl sat back down on the bed and asked if he meant she could stay in this place more comfortably. Whoosh! Well, the man turned around, walking toward the exit, and told her not to make him repeat himself, unless of course she wanted him to tie her forcibly to the bed. Demi just sat on the bed for a while in surprise, watching the man leave the room. She didn't know what to do and how to act in such a situation. At that moment a butler came through the corridors to fetch him. Then he turned to the gentleman and asked if he could know his plan of action. He stopped and said that the man had just let Demi stay in that house after all, and he still remembered the pain she had caused him, so he couldn't let it happen again. The butler lowered his head and said that Mr. David was right then in his letter. Evan interrupted him, however, and asked him not to bring up his brother. He turned to the butler and said he just wanted to know how she could have come to this place so shamelessly after sending him that letter. He also said that it just didn't make any sense, and asked that the butler Roberti keep a close eye on her. The man bowed and said that he would certainly do as he asked. Evan himself was pensive at this point, not sure what to think of Demi or why she had brought that piece of jewelry in the first place. In fact, when the guy and girl were still in their early teens, Evan came running to her one day. The girl looked at him and asked him what had happened. The guy was always shy at the sight of her, and in fact in his hands and the back of his hand was just the very brooch that the girl had now given away. He asked that the girl open her hand, and when Demi did, Evan put the jewelry there, telling her that it was a gift for her, and also asked that she promise him that she would cherish it forever. He even blushed at his feelings and said that, to be honest, this thing belonged to his mother and he had brought this piece of jewelry to give to her specifically. Demi sat on her lap, to at least keep up with her boyfriend, and asked if he was sure he wanted to give it to her, since it was expensive enough. Evan then confidently replied that of course, because his mom wouldn't use it anyway, and he had plenty of other jewelry like it, so she might not even notice it was missing. Then suddenly the guy's eyes shone, and he said that he would definitely give her a worthy gift in the future. And right now Demi was sitting and looking at that piece of jewelry, seeing her reflection there, and remembering all those moments from her childhood when he had first given it to her. She was only thinking of Evan now, not realizing how he had changed so much in such a short time. Then the girl clutched the jewelry in her hand, not understanding why he was so angry with her after all. She hid her head in her hands and cried because she couldn't take it anymore. Demi didn't know what she had done wrong, or what she should do next. Now more than ever, she wanted Taehyun to come and comfort her and tell her what direction to take. Until 5 years ago, the girl had worked as a maid in Lady Romerby's house. When the woman came to inspect her work, she angrily asked if she had asked her to return the seal when she had finished her paperwork. Lady Romerby had in her hand the special pointer with which she had used to beat Demi, and she wondered why she had kept it on her desk all this time. The girl apologized, but said that Lady Romerby had asked her to stay until she had finished her work, and she still had a few tasks to do. Then Lady Romerby went up to the girl and slapped her, shouting, asking if she thought it was all her fault. Demi was very surprised, and the woman continued to shout, asking how dare she consider herself a noble Lady Romerby when she didn't even approve of their marriage to her son. The woman swung a pointer at her to punish her for disobedience. The girl began to scream, saying she could not have thought such a thing, and the maids were standing outside the door to overhear this. When it came time for the beating, they began to talk over each other. One of them said that Lady Romerby always turns her words around and doesn't understand why Demi doesn't just apologize. The other maid laughed and said that she probably still had a noble pride in her that she couldn't get rid of. However, the other maid laughed and asked how else noble when her family went bankrupt and sold her name for a pittance. The maids became very embarrassed when Taehyun walked past them. He pretended not to hear their conversation, and they started walking away quickly so they wouldn't get caught talking. At this very time, the mother was just about to slap the girl's hands again as a punishment for disobedience. And the man peered through the slit, and after watching for a while, just closed the door without even doing anything or standing up for poor Demi. After that, the girl came out. This time she got not only on her hands, but also on her face. She sat on a small couch and could hardly hold back her tears, because she could not show her weakness. After a while, she heard someone calling her name. Demi immediately looked up and saw her beloved Taehyun, The man pretended to be incredibly concerned for his girlfriend and said he heard her mom slap her again while he was gone. He also apologized, saying that he needed to be there for her. He was sorry that she had to go through all of this alone. Because Demi loved him very much, she of course believed his words, for it seemed to her that it was very sincere. She smiled back at him and told him that everything was fine and she understood. The man sat down next to her, and she also said she knew full well that he was doing his best outside the house to get their marriage approved by Mother, so she held no grudge against him. The man was about to say something, but Demi interrupted him and said it was still kind of weird. I mean, he pretended to be very surprised, wondering what exactly was weird to her. Demi puts her head down and says she did everything her mother told her to do, but she keeps insisting that the girl was wrong, even though that's absolutely not true. Somewhere else he'd heard it. That made him wary. He took his hands off the girl and looked away, wondering if she really thought her mother was wrong. Demi realized at this point that she had gone a little overboard and she shouldn't have said that, so she immediately replied to the Taehyun that she didn't mean it at all. When the man wiped the tears from her face and said he thought her family's downfall had just messed up her whole mind, Demi believed him and asked, "Does he really think that?" Taehyun replied that that was exactly what he thought, and she just didn't have time to rest properly since all the time was spent paying off family debt. But the man hugged Demi and said it's okay now. He was there for her, and she didn't have to worry. She could just trust him. At this point he was smiling evilly and in a quiet voice, so added that she could leave all the business to him and not worry about anything else. Demi, of course, was very fond of him. They kissed, and the girl said that of course she trusted her sweet prince. This situation was more like when a butterfly is looking for a quiet and peaceful home, but ends up caught in the web of a huge spider that will eventually just eat it. From that moment on, the girl's life was not easy. Her mother yelled at her all the time, and eventually even Taehyung began to question her words. He said that her illness was getting worse every day, and she was starting to say things that weren't true. And Mother constantly beat poor Demi, telling her she was doing everything wrong, even though she herself had originally told her to do just that. Of course, as time went on, the girl just had to go along with it all, and she even began to think that she just deserved to be beaten, because she was really doing something wrong. She also kept apologizing to Taehyun, asking why she couldn't be better for him when he was helping her so much and doing everything he could for her happiness. And so you passed day after day, and soon fall flowed smoothly into a cold and frosty winter. Demi was still living in that horrible house where she had been abused. Once she even fell asleep on the desk because of extreme fatigue. Her hands, of course, were always covered with scars or new cuts, but the girl didn't feel any pain from them, because she was so used to it that she didn't even pay attention to it. It had become her routine. One winter day, Taehyun suddenly approached her, holding a piece of paper in his hand, and asked her why she should not transcribe an ancient chant that day. He also said that if she did what she liked, her condition might even get much better. Demi at this moment was very happy that she could finally do her favorite thing, and smiled at him, and said that she would give it a try. In fact, the girl had severe bruises under her eyes because she couldn't get a good night's sleep. Taehyun liked that she agreed to this, so he told her to write down what he said. The girl, with a trembling hand, picked up a quill and began to write down the words. The man spoke what was written on the sheet. It asked, "How can one not laugh while the waters wander with pestilence and defilement?" The divine punishment is finally accomplished. And then God said that those who are blinded by greed will go to hell. But for mere mortals drowned in defilement, even the pride of hellfire is too generous. Demi didn't listen to the words, she just wrote everything down. In fact, she noticed that she'd never heard the chant before, and it sounded more like a curse than a divine sermon. A few hours later, the man approached her. "I'm asking if she's done yet, finally." He then asked as the girl let him see if she had recorded everything well. After a while, Taehyung read it and said it was just great and she did a great job. Demi was happy about that and thanked him for saying those words. The man puts his arm around her and asks her to trust and just follow him. Then she will feel much better. He promises the girl that. After that, he went outside, where an aide was already waiting for him. He bowed to the Lord and asked if he needed him. Taehyun approached him and said that he now had a very urgent letter to send. He handed the man a black envelope with the royal seal and asked that he give it to the Hasworths. He also asked him to give it to Yvonne himself. The very next evening, Evan arrived under the palace. However, the guards would not let him in. He asked them to go and tell them that he had come to see Demi. But the man continued to hold him, saying that the Lord had ordered that no one should be let in without his personal permission. Evan tried to break through again, but then he saw the door creak open behind him, and a man appeared. He was standing there with a very satisfied look on his face. And then he turned to the guards and told him to go, whether he was pleased or not. However, he is still a guest of this house. Evan then walked closer to Tai Yeon and, calling his name by his forehead, greeted him in that very manner. Thoth immediately inquired why he was at his manor so late, and whether he had not even been brought in about his arrival. Evan in turn said that he had only come to see Demi, not to see him in person. Daehyun immediately became very serious and apologized for saying that, but he said that Demi didn't want to see him. The guy immediately got angry. He grabbed him by his coat and started yelling, telling him that she would never do such a thing, and he's pretty sure the guy himself had something to do with the whole letter thing. Taekyeon only smiled, and then said that he had no idea what letter the guy was talking about, but he had just kept quiet and stayed away after Demi's family fell. So it's no wonder she feels that way about him now. The man also added that how he now wished he could get some comfort from her when he himself had not shown the same. At that moment, Evan's hands went slack. He stammered, asking what he was saying. Then he added that he couldn't help her at the time. The master of the manor turned away from him and asked when he wouldn't. He had at least an idea of how the girl felt and what she was even going through. Daehyun also said that of course she didn't express it openly, but since then her feelings for him weren't positive. She didn't feel anything good about Evan. And now it's very rude of him to call another man's wife at night. And besides, Demi feels uncomfortable around him, so he thinks it would be better for the guy to just leave. Evan had no choice but to leave. Then Taekyeon returned to the manor, and Demi heard him coming in from the street and called out to him at once. When she saw him enter the room alone, the girl asked in surprise if they had a guest. The man pretended not to understand and asked what she was talking about. Demi was getting nervous. Then she said that she had heard that someone had come to the house, but the man didn't think much of it and said that she must have imagined it. But the girl still kept insisting and said that she was sure she heard it perfectly well. Taehyun smiled and replied that he had just said that she had just imagined it because he hadn't heard anything. This all seemed very strange to Demi. She decided to agree, however, and lowered her head, saying that since he was saying that, she must have imagined it. Well, then suddenly the man came closer to her and raised her head and asked, "Why don't they stop talking about such trivialities and get down to business?" Without waiting for any response, he suddenly started kissing the girl on the lips. She didn't resist. Evan was walking back to his house in the cold, and he took one last look at the estate and saw their reflection in the window. He sighed heavily and clutched the letter in his hand, and after that, he just threw it on the ground without giving it any thought. He knew it was over, and there was nothing he could do about it. Well, then he calmed his feelings and went back for that envelope. When Evan returned home, he reread the letter again. He realized that it was definitely Demi's handwriting, because it couldn't be otherwise. But given that letter she'd sent him the day after David's shipwreck, he figured it was her way of severing their entire relationship. After all these years, the man was able to find the letter and reread it again. Evan had no doubt that she had written it, but a knock on the door interrupted his thoughts, and he let himself in at once. It was a maid named Philia. She bowed to the master and asked what he wanted since he had called her. The man in turn said that from now on she and Maid May will serve the baby. The girl will be in the house for some more time. That's why she needs help. Philia heard this and was very surprised. She didn't expect her guest to still be in the annex, but she said that everything would be done in the best possible way. Evan then asked that they be very careful and cautious, and if anything happened, to come to him immediately and report back. Soon the maids had gathered all the necessary things and prepared food for the guests, and came to the annex where she lived. They walked in silence for a while, but then Philia suddenly turned to her friend and said that she could feel it. May was very surprised and asked what she felt. The girl asked in surprise what meant that, and wondered if she didn't also feel it. That strange relationship between this lady and the gentleman. Philia also said that it had been 5 years since Mr. and Mrs. Hasward had passed away. which meant that their master, the second son, had taken over and had been in charge of the family for a very long time. And now at last the time had come for him to meet the right lady for him. The girl also said cheerfully that they would now serve the new lady of the house, who would be the new mistress of the house in the future. May didn't pay any attention to it. She shook her head and told the maid that she knew about her obsession, but the girl had to be careful. When Philia heard this, she looked at her friend in surprise, not understanding why she was the one saying such things. Then the woman explained that this girl was no stranger to the area. She was at Mr. David's funeral, and upon hearing this, the girl was incredibly surprised and asked how this was even possible. The maid kept talking and said that ever since he had heard of his brother's shipwreck, Mr. Hasworth had been beyond sad. However, when the woman showed up at the funeral, he immediately became enraged and started yelling loudly at her, calling her various obscene words. May looked at the maid and said that she must have missed it because she had to stay home. But this was really absolute madness. It was really hard for the master to restrain himself, let alone ask that he stop saying these horrible things. She also said that she didn't know how the girl might feel. However, there certainly can't be anything between them, at least not after that very funeral. Philia didn't think about it for long, and after that she blushed a bit because of her thoughts, and also said that it was very strange, because she was usually very good at such things, and when she was wrong about it, it caused her to be surprised. May didn't say anything to that. She stared at her partner for a while and then moved on, thinking about what she had seen with her own eyes. And even after this incident, this girl and a handsome man with black hair left the house together. At that moment, Demi was outside the room that had been assigned to her. She decided to go out into the hallway and went to the window, looking at the snowflakes, which were falling from the sky incredibly fast and beautifully. But then she was suddenly interrupted from her musings by Evan's voice, who came up behind her and asked if she was so stubborn that she couldn't just sit in her room and stay out of his sight. The man looked very angry and stern. Then Demi turned to him, and tucking her hair behind her ear, said that she thought it was time for her to leave now that the wind had died down. Evan was surprised to ask what she was even talking about, however. The snow was still very heavy. He looked at the unhappy girl, who could barely contain her emotions, and said he didn't really want to see a frozen body on his property and then still have to deal with all the problems that would come with it. So he sighed heavily and told her to stay and get better soon. As he said these words, Evan turned his gaze to the battered hands that the girl held by her side. Demi thought for a while, and afterwards said confidently that she could no longer cause him such inconvenience. Evan, however, let out a loud laugh at this point, and asked if she really thought the Hasworths couldn't fit another person into their home. He also said that she could definitely not worry about it, because he was no longer the simple and naive boy she used to care about as a nobleman. Demi became very uncomfortable with these words, and she lowered her head and just remained silent. This went on for several minutes. Then their awkward silence was interrupted by Evan's cough, and he said, turning around, that he was surprised that she had refused all the maids he had assigned to her and was cleaning the room herself. And looking at the situation, he assumed that she must be anxious to do something. He bent down to be eye level with the girl and said that in that case she would do her usual work, since she was not sitting still. When Demi heard this, she was incredibly surprised and asked what he meant when he said regular job. But Evan smiled and said that she would do the job as mistress of this house, and asked what she thought about it. At that moment, Demi became uneasy. She hadn't expected him to be able to call her mistress of the house, and she was incredibly startled and surprised. After a short silence, the girl couldn't stand it and screamed and asked, "What does all this mean?" Evan, however, only laughed. After he calmed down, he asked what she was even thinking. What he really meant was doing the job of being a housewife, not being that housewife. Evan also said that Travia the butler was doing very well with all the duties alone, and it was a little overwhelming for him. So the man decided to make it a little easier on him and asked that Demi help him. But he also added that it wouldn't be very nice to order noble people around. That was why she would be paid generously for the work she had done. Demi was very surprised, because she thought it would all be free, and then wondered how much he would pay. The man suddenly smiled and asked, "Is she really that interested in money?" And he didn't think it was even possible. Demi didn't answer anything to that. In fact, she couldn't help it. After all, she was in such a hurry that she couldn't even take the savings she had left in that house. That's why the girl has to try to earn the right amount of money to go to Taiwan and finally find out what's even going on. So after thinking about all this, the girl lowered her head and said okay. She would do all this until the blizzard stopped. But after that, she would immediately go on her way and leave him alone. Evan sighed a little, even sad at the sight of her. But then he started to walk out, saying so be it. He also asked that the girl talk to the butler and learn everything from him. As the man started to walk, Demi turned and asked in return if it wouldn't bring him a loss. To this, however, the man merely waved his hand and said that the Hasworth family was never at a loss. As the man walked away, Demi looked at him with a very sad look and thought to herself that all was right. He was just that, a Hasworth. Then she thought, really? Is that why his whole family avoided her when her own family fell apart? Did they do it to avoid seeing all that financial loss? After all, they are so noble and rich. In fact, this very Hasworth family is very entrepreneurial, and they operate on the principle that Evan just said. They never take any losses. This philosophy eventually brought this family immense financial power, enough to control an entire empire. Evan's parents, being particularly successful, sought to establish connections with nobles in order to enter the central and political circle. And that's how the situation brought all three of them together. Demi, Evan, and Taehyun. Even as children, the three of them were together. After all, the only prestigious noblemen in the vicinity of Vine at that time were precisely the Barons Lorenz, the girl's family, and the Earls of Romerby, who were from the Taehyun family. The three families met fairly regularly, holding business lunches and dinners, and what the children had between them was something special. But now, thinking about it all, Demi supposed that it was probably just her childhood illusion, when you don't think about any problems, and see only the good in everything. She watched the growth of the Hasworth family with her own eyes. Her father started a business to follow suit and become rich as well. However, the result of all this was his complete failure, which destroyed the entire family, and this very collapse of the family ended Demi's childhood. And all the girl had left at that point was a huge amount of debt from her father. Evan had distanced himself from them, and so Demi was left with only Taehyun. Although she loved spending time with the two of them, it broke the girl's heart. She didn't understand why Evan did that. Immediately after talking to the man, the girl went to the office to do her first job. Evan also warned her that she wouldn't have any money if she messed up and did something wrong. When Evan said that the chores overwhelmed even the butler, Demi became worried. However, when she got down to the tasks, it turned out to be much smaller and easier than what Lady Romerby had made her do. The girl was also allowed to treat all her wounds and bandage her hands so that they would heal as soon as possible. And as Demi did her work, she kept thinking about her past life and the torment she had endured. On one of these days, she was sitting in the office, which was allocated to her, and worked again. But then suddenly a maid came in and said that she brought tea for her, because the girl has been working for quite a long time. Demi, when she saw Philia, immediately took her hands off to the side and thanked her for it. In fact, she was pleased that the maids cared for her so much, because they didn't do that in the lady's house. But at that moment, Evan suddenly appeared behind the maid. He immediately turned to her and asked if she had finished her task. The maid, hearing his voice, was immediately startled and almost dropped the tray she was holding. But then suddenly Evan came into the room and said, smiling, that he too liked the so-called tea party. Afterward, the maid quickly set a small table for the boy and girl to have tea, just as Evan had wanted. The man sat quietly opposite Demi and drank his tea. There was an awkward silence between them. After all, no one knew what to talk about, and the girl thought it was better for her to keep quiet. Then she looked at her bandaged hands and remembered that she had forgotten to thank him. So she said thank you for taking care of her wounds. Evan didn't even deign to look at her and told her to ignore it, because there was nothing wrong with it, and that's what anyone in his position would do. But afterward, the man set his cup on the table and addressed her by her full first and last name, and inquired why Demi was on his estate, and for what purpose she had come that night. The girl lowered her head, and replied that she had come then to return what he had once given her. Evan wondered if she meant jewelry, but then he wondered why she decided to do it now, on that particular day. He continued to ask questions and asked if she wanted money in return for the jewelry. Demi felt very uncomfortable. She immediately got up from her seat and shouted back that she was not at all. The man did not expect such an action, and even jumped a little, but the girl stood there trembling in front of her eyes. She was in tears, but she didn't know why she had come to this place. When she escaped from the fisherman's house then, the only thing in her pocket was this accessory. Ademi ran through the cold streets and thought about that thing. She didn't know if she wanted to rely on the warmth of her childhood, not knowing that it had changed so much since then. Evan was silent for a while after that, looking at the girl. He asked if she didn't come for the money. Did Tae-young ask her to give back everything he had once given her? Demi couldn't believe that he could actually make such assumptions. And then, looking him straight in the eye, she asked him what he was talking about. She said that Tae-young was out of town. It's been 5 years since he left for the capital, and he hasn't been heard from since. Evan became indignant. He didn't understand how she could talk like that, and wondered what she was even talking about, where the idiot had gone then. He looked at the girl in surprise then, and asked if she wasn't living with the Tae-hyun now. Demi jerked at the sound of his voice. She was shaking all over, but she didn't want to answer it. Then he began to shout, asking her to answer his question. The girl put her head down and didn't know what to do. Her heart was beating so hard she could hear it. She did not know how she should answer his question. Should she say that they had not lived together for years, that she was like a maid and the fat Lady Romerby's fat Lady Romerby lived there? To say that that horrible woman even planned to kill her because of it, she even had to run away from that house. Demi sighed heavily then and realized that, not at all. She didn't want to humiliate herself even more right in front of Evan. Her body was still shaking from all those emotions, but she was thinking about what she should say to him so she wouldn't hurt him more. After a while, Evan had had enough of waiting. He put his head down and turned, sighing heavily, to tell her that she had come from Romerby to his estate in a blizzard, not even properly dressed. He asked, "Is this really how her family does their job?" He wanted to ask something else, but then he said he knew perfectly well that she hated him, but wondered if she couldn't at least be honest with him now. Demi stood for a while longer, the wood that was in the fireplace making its crackling sound, and that was the only sound in the room. Soon the girl finally sat back in her seat and turned to Evan. Looking at the man in surprise, she wondered why she should hate him, since she had never done so. She had always treasured their friendship and companionship. When Evan heard this, he straight up froze. He hadn't expected it, but the heat in the room and the heavy topics they were discussing made him blush. Then the man wondered what about that letter. How could she hate him when she had clearly written about it? Demi asked in surprise what letter she was talking about, because she didn't understand anything. But he decided not to say anything. Angry, he turned away from her and said it didn't matter. Demi said in a sad voice that she was sorry anyway that he thought that about her, and he was really right. At this point, they weren't living anymore with the techie. The man only said that he understood. They sat in silence for a while. But then he suddenly stood up and said that if she was finished with her work, she could go and rest and gain strength. Demi said she would, but as he started to walk away, she asked him to stop and wondered if he'd had any more contact with Tech since then. She also said that the two of them had been so close before. When Evan heard this, he looked at her in surprise and asked who had ever told her they were close. But he didn't say another word to me. He just walked out the door, because he was just annoyed with the situation and didn't want to discuss anything else. When Demi was alone, she put her head down and looked down and thought about what she assumed Evan knew about the Taehyun's whereabouts, because it would help her a lot. A few more hours had passed since then, and it was getting dark outside. The girl cleaned herself up in preparation for bed, and when she got to her bedroom, she immediately closed the curtains. She lay on her soft and warm bed, wondering if it would stop snowing the next day. The girl realized that she must go to the capital as soon as possible and see her lover, because only he can stop Lady Romerby. She turned on her other side and realized that if she went to the capital with absolutely no money, she wouldn't even have time to find Tae-hyun before they did terrible things to her and just dumped her on the side of the road somewhere, as if she wasn't even human. After thinking about a few more things, it wasn't long before Demi finally fell asleep, and a few hours later the door to her room suddenly opened. A small light suddenly squeezed inside. It was Evan. He walked over to the girl's bed, holding the candlelight in his hands, and just stared at her sleeping for a while. He was actually very sorry to see her in such a state, for the girl was incredibly beautiful, and she was being abused like this. Evan brushed some of her hair away from her forehead, thinking about how long it had been torturous for her, and how hard it was for him to live every moment of his struggle to stop this endless longing for her. He didn't know what to do to drown out the lingering feelings, which never went away even after her marriage to a completely different man. He didn't know what to do, because these feelings wouldn't stop. It wasn't until he eventually received a letter that he managed to stifle those feelings. A letter that showed a ship that mocked the death of his family. It was an insult expressed in the refined background of a noble man, and it was written in Demi's handwriting. And when she showed up at the funeral in the arms of a completely different man, he was finally able to make a final decision. That it would be easier for him to just hate the girl, and Evan decided to resent her wholeheartedly. All because he'd been so helplessly infatuated with Demi that if it hadn't been for such a serious incident, he'd never even been able to bring himself to hate her. At that moment, as he was fixing the hair on her head, the girl suddenly twisted around and started mooing, as if waking up already. Evan realized that in order to avoid being seen, he needed to remove his hand immediately. So he did. Then he looked down at the girl's mangled hands, which were soaked with blood even through the bandages. He didn't understand why she came to him looking so frail, and Evan realized that he absolutely couldn't contain himself any longer if she kept looking like this. He quickly bandaged the girl's hands with new bandages, and treated them with a special ointment to make them heal. Evan, watching her sleeping peacefully, realized that he would have to be sure to call a doctor when the snow finally ended, because this could be something serious, and regular bandages wouldn't be enough in this case. Then he turned around and started to leave, but suddenly froze. He heard the voice of the girl Demi, who was calling for Taehyung even through his sleep. It upset him and even made him a little angry. He stared at the girl for a while, then went out and closed the door quietly so as not to wake her. At that moment, the butler suddenly came to him and was very happy to see him, because he had been looking for him for so long. Evan immediately asked what was wrong. The butler replied that the investigation about the roamer bees was already over. Evan didn't want to hear the rest of it, so he asked them to go to his office, where he could tell them everything. They soon came into the study, and the man immediately sat down at his desk. Then the butler said that there was a rumor that the Dowager Lady Romerby was looking for her maid. When Evan heard this, he was very surprised and asked if it was really the maid. The butler confirmed and said that according to the source, the wanted maid was formerly a noblewoman, and all the circumstances pointed to Miss Lawrence. Then he said there was another rumor that the Dowager Lady Romerby was trying to hire an assassin, and the man suggested that the target was precisely their guest, Miss Lawrence. When Evan heard this, he couldn't contain his emotions and slammed his fists down hard on the table. He realized at once that, of course, the Taehyun was not without hands.